So for this presentation, we will discuss an analysis of Malaysian economic performance in relation to Sustainable Development Goals 8, which focuses on decent work and economic growth. So SDG 8 emphasizes sustainable economic growth and the creation of stable employment opportunities. However, in Malaysia, economic growth doesn't always translate into sufficient job creation, leading to challenges such as unemployment and labor market instability. Therefore, this study analyzed Malaysia's GDP growth and employment rate from 2013 to 2022 to examine trends, variability, and their relationship in supporting SDG 8 objective. The analysis used secondary data obtained from the World Bank and UN SDG database and applied quantitative methods such as numerical measure, depreciation analysis, and comparative analysis across the time period.
For this study, both qualitative and quantitative data are used to analyze Malaysia's economic and employment conditions. First, qualitative data focus on employment by job sector. Employment is grouped into three main sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, and services. This data show how workers are distributed across different sectors and allows comparison of employment patterns between them. Next, quantitative data consists of numerical indicators used in the study. These include Malaysia's GDP growth rate and unemployment rate from 2013 to 2022. The data is analyzed using statistical measures such as mean, median, and standard deviation. It also helps to identify trends over time and examine the relationship between economic growth and unemployment. Lastly, all data used in the study are secondary data obtained from reliable sources, such as the World Bank, the Department of Statistics Malaysia, and the UN SDG database. Using secondary data provides a broader and more reliable view of Malaysia's economic and labor market conditions. This section presents Malaysia's employment distribution across three main sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, and services. The data shows that the service sector has the largest share of employment and continues to increase over time, rising from about 59% in 2013 to over 62% in 2022. This increase reflects the growing demand for service-related jobs such as tourism, technology, education, and business, especially in urban areas where more office-based employment is available. In contrast, employment in the agriculture sector has steadily declined from around 12.6% to about 10%. This decline is mainly due to increased automation in farming and rural to urban migration, where workers move to cities in search of better paying and more stable jobs. Meanwhile, the manufacturing sector remains relatively stable throughout the period, staying between 21 and 23%. This suggests that the industrial and factory jobs have been maintained consistently, even though the economy is shifting in other areas. Overall, the data shows a clear trend where more people are working in service, fewer in agriculture, and manufacturing remains fairly constant. This highlights how Malaysia's workforce is gradually shifting toward a service-oriented economy, in line with economic development and the goals of Sustainable Development Goal 8, which focus on decent work and economic growth.
So based on numerical measure, the unemployment rate recorded median of 3.55% with median of 3.35%. This indicates that unemployment in Malaysia remained relatively stable over the study period. In contrast, GDP growth recorded a median of 4.20% and show greater fluctuation across year. And next, the measure of depression further supports spending. The unemployment rate has a low standard deviation of 0.559, while GDP growth shows a much higher standard deviation of 3.54. This means economic growth is far more volatile compared to unemployment. So from the competitive analysis, during the period 2013 to 2019, Malaysia experienced stable unemployment and consistent economic growth. However, during 2020 to 2022, GDP growth declined sharply due to the COVID-19 pandemic, followed by increase in unemployment, reflecting economic disruption and recovery challenges. In conclusion, in the context of SDG age, the findings show that economic volatility directly affect employment stability. Achieving this end will require not only economic growth, but also sustainable and resilient economic policies to protect jobs and support long-term development.
To begin our analysis, we are looking at the raw economic data for Malaysia spanning the decade from 2013 to 2022. On the left, we have the unemployment rate, and on the right, the GDP growth rate. For the first 7 years, our economy was remarkably stable. Unemployment stayed within a tight range of 2.9% to 3.4%. However, 2020 served as a massive turning point. You will notice that as GDP plummeted to negative 5.5% during the pandemic, the employment rate jumped to 4.5%. By 2022, we see a sharp V-shaped recovery with GDP bouncing back to 9%. When we group this data into class intervals, the patterns become even clearer. For unemployment, the most frequent observation are modest in the 3.0% to 3.4% range, occurring 6 times over the decade. On the GDP side, the economy spent most of its time growing between 0% and 10%. However, the single one in the negative 10% to negative 5% interval represent the extreme economic shock of 2020. This grouping helped us understand that while the pandemic was severe, it was an outlier compared to our usual economic performance. Now, let's look at the shape of our unemployment data. As you can see from the histogram and frequency polygon, the distribution is positively skewed or right skewed. This is because the tail is pulled to the right by the crisis years of 2020 and 2021. Before COVID-19, we were at near full employment. When the pandemic hit, unemployment peaked at 5.3% in May 2020 due to supply chain disruptions. Every 1% increase here represents hundreds of thousands of jobs lost. Fortunately, through fiscal stimulus and digital adoption, the recovery phase has seen the rate fall back toward 3.9% as of 2022. In conclusion, these two metrics show us the resilience of the Malaysian economy. Unemployment is right skewed because of the crisis spike. GDP is left skewed because of the 2020 construction. The data prove that while external shocks like COVID-19 and the US-China trade war create significant volatility, the underlying economic structure that is supported by government policy and exported diversification, it has allowed for a robust recovery. Turning to GDP growth, we see the opposite shape, a negatively skewed or left skewed distribution. The long tail on the left side represents the sharp contraction of 2020. Most of our data points sit between 0% and 5%, showing that the economy usually grows at a healthy positive rate. The 2020 construction was driven by the Movement Control Order (MCO), which hit the service and tourism sectors hardest. However, thanks to 530 billion in stimulus packages and reopening of borders, we saw a massive surge to 8.75% or 9% growth in the 2022. This indicates a strong post-pandemic recovery, though the widespread of the data reflects the economic uncertainty we faced recently.
Okay, so for now, let's look at the relationship between GDP growth and unemployment rate in Malaysia from 2013 to 2022. So for this, we use a Pearson correlation coefficient to analyze annual data for GDP growth and unemployment rate. So from our analysis, shows a moderate negative correlation between these two variables. So what this means is that when GDP growth is higher, unemployment tends to be lower. Conversely, during periods of economic slowdown, unemployment rises. So we can see a clear example of this in 2020. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Malaysia's GDP contracted by 5.5% and unemployment rose to 4.5%. So this demonstrates how economic shock can directly affect the job market. So this correlation also closely related to Sustainable Development Goal 8, which promotes decent work and economic growth. So strong economic growth helps create jobs, but it's important that this growth is inclusive so that opportunities are available to everyone. So otherwise, if the economy grows, many people might still face unemployment or underemployment. So in summary, maintaining a steady and inclusive economic growth is key to reducing unemployment and supporting overall economic stability in our country. So the data over the past decades clearly supports this connection between GDP growth and employment in Malaysia. Thank you.
To understand where Malaysia is heading, we first have to look at the last decade of data. On the surface, our performance looks steady. We've maintained an average GDP growth of 4.2%. However, the real story lies in the volatility. If we look at the coefficient of variation or CV, for GDP, it sits at a staggering 84.3%. To put that in perspective, our employment rate's volatility is only around 16%. This tells us that while our labor market is somewhat resilient, our national income and production sectors are on a roller coaster, highly exposed to external shocks. We see a negative skew in the data, meaning that while growth can disappear instantly, as we saw in 2020, the climb back to normal is a much slower, steeper hill to climb. This volatility isn't just a number, it's a direct threat to our commitment to Sustainable Development Goal 8. Under Target 8.1, we aim for sustainable growth, but with a CV of 84%, our current path is, by definition, unsustainable. The 2020 pandemic exposed how quickly supply chain disruptions can paralyze our service sector. Furthermore, regarding Target 8.5, full and decent employment, the surge to 5.3% unemployment in May 2020 proved that economic growth alone doesn't guarantee a safety net. Many of our citizens were forced into low-wage survival work. This mismatch shows us that we cannot just focus on the size of our GDP, we must focus on its stability. So, how do we fix this? Our first two recommendations focus on the structure of our economy. First, we must strengthen the labor market safety net. Our data shows that gig workers and informal laborers are hit the hardest. We are proposing a comprehensive employment insurance scheme, especially for this group. By protecting their income during downturns, we protect the nation's overall purchasing power. Second, we need to move toward a technology-based economy. The lockdowns taught us that a purely physical economy is a vulnerable one. By accelerating automation and digital economy, aligned with the Target 8.2, we ensure that Malaysia can remain productive and open for business even if future movement restrictions occur. Finally, we must address the backbone of our economy, SME, and the people who run them. The service sector is our primary growth engine. We recommend target financial incentive and tax breaks to help SME retain their staff during crisis. It is much more cost-effective to help a business keep its workers than it is to deal with the mass unemployment crisis later. Lastly, we need a massive shift in the skills development. As industry becomes more advanced, our workforce must keep pace. Our philosophy here is simple. Technology shouldn't replace humans. Humans should master the technology. Through aggressive reskilling and upskilling, we can ensure our workforce remains relevant, adaptable, and ready for whatever the next decade throws at us.
So in conclusion, this study examined Malaysian economic performance and labor market condition from 2013 to 2022. Focusing on SDG-H, which promotes decent work and economic growth. We analyzed GDP growth and unemployment rates using reliable secondary data from the World Bank, Department of Statistics Malaysia, and UN SDG database. So this finding indicated that unemployment was relatively stable before the COVID-19 pandemic. but the GDP growth was much more volatile and susceptible to external shocks, as seen in the start of economic construction in 2020 and the statistical analysis, including measure of central tendency, depression, and correlation, show a negative relationship between GDP and unemployment, confirm that economic growth generally help reduce joblessness, but employment recovery often lags behind. So based on this insight, the study highlights the importance of inclusive economic policies, social protection for vulnerable workers, and proactive for labor market intervention. For future research, it is recommended to include additional SDGH indicators, sector and regional differences, qualitative surveys, long-term effect of post-pandemic economic change, and evaluation of policy intervention.